everyone, and welcome to episode 58 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. So I've done 58 episodes of a podcast called the Medieval Podcast, and it turns out I've never actually talked in depth about when the Middle Ages were. In a way, this seems like a no-brainer because I think we all have a concept of what it involves. For example, if I said, close your eyes and picture the Middle Ages, you probably have a mental image, probably with knights or a castle in it, or maybe a pointy hat. But it's actually one of the first things to establish when you're talking about a historical era, when it is. And obviously, if someone asks me nearly every time I talk about my work if Outlander is medieval, well, there's evidently some confusion about the dates involved. So maybe my first episode should have been about this, but I will never regret making it about coconuts instead. For this episode, I invited Peter Konieczny from medievalist.net back again, not least of all because he suggested I talk about this, but also because when you run a website about the Middle Ages, you have to have some concept about when it is. Here's our chat about some dates and events that historians have used to define the beginning and the end of this era, and the mysterious few centuries that some people actually believe didn't exist. Okay, so Peter, one of the questions that we get asked a lot as medievalists is when were the Middle Ages? And I did rant on Twitter not too long ago about Outlander is not the Middle Ages. So when we were talking about what we should talk about for the next podcast, we were talking about we should actually address when the Middle Ages were, because that is a question people have for us quite a lot. Do you think?
Yes, yeah. It's the kind of question that I think medievalists have about the Middle Ages because there's many, many definitions.
Yeah, that's a good point because there isn't just one right answer to this. It's a complicated question. You'd think it would be easy, but it's really a complicated question.
I did my research on this. If you ask Google, they give you the years, exactly 476 to 1453.
Wow.
And if you look it up on Wikipedia, they're a little more vague. They say 5th century to 15th.
Ooh.
So they don't even really agree on it.
Well, I mean, if Google and Wikipedia don't know, how are any of us supposed to know? When I talk to people, I generally say 500 to 1500, and there's reasons for that, which we can get into. When people ask you, what do you normally come out with?
My kind of go-to answer is from the 4th century to the early 16th.
Oh, right. Well, yours is expanded. Wow, yeah. I go with 1,000 years because I figure that's nice and neat. Yours is a bit stretched out.
Now, medievalist.net, we kind of stretch it out to like end of 16th century because, we want that sweet Elizabethan talk on the website. So
yeah, exactly. Because the Tudors, right? Everyone wants to know about the Tudors. By my reckoning, the Tudors are early modern, but medievalist.net keeps them in there. So, okay, so let's start with the beginning. If we were to say, when did the Middle Ages start, what are some of the options people come up with? Like, what are some of the dates that people come up with for when the Middle Ages started? Oh, before we even start with that, Peter, and I might need to edit this so it doesn't sound like I'm surprised. The Middle Ages actually comes from Latin medium aevum or medium aevum, however you want to say it, which means the Middle Ages. And that means the time between the glorious Roman Empire in the classical period and the Renaissance, when all of this learning was rediscovered and people went from being stupid to being smart again, right?
Yeah. So basically it is people in the Renaissance kind of like, hey, with a period that's in between us and, our glorious forefathers, that's a middle period.
Yeah.
So they're kind of defining it their ways. So
yeah, let's just skip over that part, right?
Yeah,
so when people say medieval ages, that's actually saying Middle Ages. So it's either Middle Ages or medieval. That's why we go with that, because it comes from the actual words Middle Ages. So the beginning of the Middle Ages, what are some of the options people have for when does it actually start?
Well, we've got the kind of two ones that kind of just go by century, so 400 or 500, and that's just because they're nice round numbers. There's one number I'll kind of throw out that's a little earlier, and it's the year 312, just about there.
Okay, what happened in 312, Peter?
This is when the Roman Emperor Constantine, he has this conversion. He sees a symbol of Christ in the sky, and he decides, Christianity is not a bad thing. It's this kind of process where the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. I think, like that one is because Christianity has such a fundamental change in Europe and even the Middle East and North Africa that it really has a big impact. And that seems to be a nice kind of staging post from one era to another. So that's one that I kind of see as a likely candidate, but I don't think many people will kind of accept it because he's Constantine's still considered like an ancient. It's a religious thing, not a political change, right?
Yeah, and these two things are they're kind of intertwined in the reasons why we might say there's a beginning and the end to the period. But you're right. So when you talk about, you said that an early date for you is the 4th century. Are you thinking of Emperor Constantine when you're thinking about this 4th century change?
Yeah. Like there's a shifting. Like he also shifts the empire into two. So we have Eastern and Western Roman Empire. So it seems like his reign is a big shift in that time, and it kind of is the end of the ancient period almost, but it's not the end of the Roman Empire.
So when you're talking about splitting it into two, we're talking about the Roman Empire as in Western Empire, and it's really centered around Rome, and the Byzantine Empire, which is centered around Byzantium or Constantinople. But they're still all Roman Empire at this point. And the Roman Empire politically is still recognizably the Roman Empire for another 100 years after Constantine decides to become Christian, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we still have the Roman Empire, still keeps going. If you want to look at another date, it's the end of the Western Roman Empire, and there's a real specific date, September 4th, 476. Romulus Augustus, he was Roman emperor for like I think it's just a few days or something like that, but he gets deposed. He says, there won't be any more Roman emperors.
Yes, so the Western Roman Empire is finished on that date, September 4th, 476. People reckon there is no more Western Roman Empire at that point. The Roman Empire, as we have known it, is centered around Byzantium, and it's kind of more Greek in its culture than it is kind of classical Roman, right?
Yeah, like people kind of take a look at it as that part of the Roman Empire is not Roman enough, or it's somehow different than the kind of empire that was around 100 or 200 years later, right? Like the Byzantines always consider themselves Roman.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they say, we're the Roman Empire. And it's great what they call like the people in the West, the Latins. You're the Latins.
That's right. They still call themselves the Roman Empire, which is why they are not the same as the Holy Roman Empire, which has to distinguish itself separately. That's, I think, why people really call it the Byzantine Empire, so it's not the Holy Roman Empire. Doesn't get confused when you're talking about history, for sure. But for me, I don't like. I do say 500, so it's around the same time, but the empire starts to collapse around 400. It starts to recede from the edges. So if we talk about like the Romans leaving Britain, for example, like it starts to pull back from the edges of the empire around 400. So to me, like that's the start of the collapse. And yeah, for me, I pick 500 because it's nice and round, but picturing it as being the empire collapsing over the course of about 100 years, I think.
Yeah, like you have various kind of events. Like say this last Roman emperor gets deposed. It's not like he was an important figure at the time, or that the city of Rome was even an important place. This is almost like a shifting out of the janitorial staff, at the office. Like they're minor figures at this point. Just
Yeah. They haven't even finished carving his bust yet, and he's
yeah.
deposed.
Exactly. And like historians can pick this date, but like on the ground, I don't think anyone really saw, oh man, the Roman Empire is now finished. I guess we're kind of to call it a new era because the Roman Empire was finished long before Romulus Augustus came around. So.
Yeah, exactly. We have to change our letterhead to say something else. So that's a political division that people tend to go with. A centralized empire is no more and becomes quote unquote feudalism after that. The structure of society is a bit different from when it was under the Roman Empire. And I think you do have to be careful when you think about this because this is coming into the period people used to call the Dark Ages. And still when I talk to people about this, they say, well, if the Roman Empire was great and, it was centralized administration and stuff, and this all collapses, isn't that bad for everybody? Like, isn't this bad? And I say, well, like, bad for who? Like, because the Roman Empire had a lot of slavery, right? Are we talking about who is this bad for? So when we think about this collapse of a classical, amazing civilization, we really need to think about what this meant for the people on the ground. Anyway, that's just my little point to make about the quote unquote Dark Ages.
This is the kind of period, sometimes called the Age of Migration, right? Where you have various kinds of peoples moving around Europe, rising to the fore. Others seem to travel, like there's one group called the Vandals that kind of start out in Northern Europe and make their way through Iberia into Africa and wind up in like modern day Tunisia. You're seeing the city of Rome become like basically a shell of itself. Rome's population declines probably by 5 or 6 fold during this period. And yeah, like there's a decline, but it's not necessarily what's happening in other parts of Europe.
Yeah. History books, they used to call this barbarian invasions, right? And it's like, well, who is calling them barbarians? And who, like, they are barbarians from whose perspective? So we really kind of need to look at that and take that apart. If you haven't interrogated these words, Dark Ages and barbarian invasions, then it's time to kind of look at what they mean.
It's often gets depicted as a fairly violent time, but it's often like this crunching of history, right? Where you have various groups that come in, and there's one battle that happens in year 410, and another battle happens in 437, and somehow like those two get conflated as it's the same conflict, which is not, right? So.
Yeah, it's like 2 different generations worth of warriors, but anyway. So we were talking about religious change in terms of Christianity. We're talking about political change in terms of the quote unquote fall of the Western Empire. And then another marker that people use for perhaps the beginning of the Middle Ages is the Islamic expansion. So again, this is a religious marker if we're going with that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the kind of like big historians, medieval historians of the 20th century is Henri Pirenne. And part of his kind of thesis is like the Middle Ages really for him starts around the year 700. And he kind of put it in terms like there's this Islamic expansion that kind of cuts off the Mediterranean from Europe. That's how he saw it. And it forces changes within Europe and kind of ushers in this feudalism age, things like that. So he's kind of seeing that rise of Islam as a kind of massive change for even outside of Islamic land. And like there's part of it, like, I think Muhammad and the rise of Islam is probably one of the central events of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, for sure.
And it sure has a big impact. But is it the start? Is it even a start in the Arabian world? It's hard to tell, right? The forces of history, they are still pushing along. I have some interest in that. Like, I don't think Henri Pirenne was kind of saw as a very much of a conflict. But, more historians is kind of seeing more like this is more a lot of trade is opening up, a lot of cultural contacts. And he didn't quite see that. His research didn't really kind of reflect on that. So I think he almost kind of saw it as a break as opposed to kind of seeing interactions, right?
Yeah. So there's 2 important things I want to pull out here from what you're saying. And the first one is that we are talking about Europe here. And that when we talk about the Middle Ages, it tends to be talking about Europe because people who are dealing with different parts of the world may not divide time periods into the same terms that we do. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. And the second is that it is fluid. It's constantly fluid, right? So it's not just that there was a time, like you say, where we have to change the rubber stamp and we're not in the Roman Empire anymore. We are now in the Middle Ages, not the classical period. So the Islamic expansion, that's really important, as you say. So Muhammad is born in the 6th century and Islam spreads really, really quickly. And the trade and the spread of Islam is very widespread and it's very quick. But again, it's something that's really hard to pin down to a certain date, because it happens quickly, but it also happens over time. So it's hard to pin that one down like the other dates that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think, sometimes you're kind of taking a look at an era that this rise of Islam is probably 100-year era, right? Even like this city of Baghdad doesn't get formed until the middle of the 8th century. It's, again, a really ongoing process, but it's somewhat like, I think in the kind of the Islamic world, it's the pivotal moment. And in some sense, it has a larger effect on the wider like Eurasian world from Europe, Africa, Asia. It definitely makes changes, right? Political, but much more like cultural and even economic. I think sometimes even people think rise of Islam is the return of a kind of a classical civilization.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of Islamic scholars were studying classical texts from Greece and Rome and stuff like that. And so when we talk about the Renaissance, this kind of rebirth, well, I think it's simplistic in general. But a lot of the texts that we think had disappeared during this quote unquote dark ages, they never disappeared. Islamic scholars were translating these and working with these, even if Christians in Europe were not doing that. So the rise of Islam is super, super important. Some people have marked this as the beginning of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, like I think when we kind of make this definition, we're talking from an English-speaking world, right? So we start off in like England and kind of spread our way out in how we define the world or in history and things like that. And part of that is, you and me are English speakers, so that's, our point of reference. Also, like the British Empire had, a fairly distinctive way of, here's our events of history. So, we kind of think of like the Victorian age or the Elizabethan age. Those things don't even apply. Like the Victorian age doesn't apply to like France, but it's still a very important fact. Like in Canada, we have a Victorian age, right? Just because we were a colony at that time of the UK. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very good argument to be made to blow up all these terms in general by considering working within the parameters of the English-speaking world. We call this time the Middle Ages. What are we talking about? That's what we're focused on today. But when we talk in global terms, well, I'm not sure how useful the idea of the Middle Ages is kind of at all. But anyway, that is a whole other podcast completely, not just episode. Okay, we've passed about the year 700. And we are in still quote unquote dark ages, the early Middle Ages, which we wanted to talk about this, which is something I've never heard about before, is a time that some people think never existed. Right. Okay. So Peter, what's the argument about this time that never existed?
Oh, yeah. So there's this beautiful thesis. It's called the phantom time hypothesis, kind of developed by like a German historian is probably not the best word to describe it, but a German guy. He's looking at calendars. There's little oddities in how much longer it exactly takes this Earth to go around the sun, right? So how does that line up with calendars? And he couldn't figure out at that time why calendars missed a couple of days. And he got to thinking that they missed a couple of days because it didn't exist. And it's one of those thought experiments that go haywire. He comes with the idea that Emperor Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, he wants to live in the year 1000. And it's because, it's a 1000th anniversary of Jesus' birth. I'd love to live at this time. So he cooks up the books, like literally all the history books, that the years 614 to 911 don't exist. That they didn't happen, but whatever that was written in that, including the whole reign of Charlemagne, is made up. Charlemagne in particular is made up because he's a good role model, and like this is who Otto dreams to be a great emperor. So he comes up with this idea. It's like a theory that emerges in the 1990s and interesting stuff. And if you go onto Google and you do enough searching, you can find lots of people talking about it.
Yeah, I had never heard of this. But you put me onto a YouTube episode about this on a YouTube channel called Half as Interesting. So the theory goes that there were a couple people in the 700s, Emperor Otto, Pope Sylvester, and perhaps the Byzantine Emperor. And they were like, we want to live in the year 1000. And so they just pretended it was the year 1000. So this German dude in the 90s says, we know that this is true, quote unquote true, because there isn't enough documentary evidence to show that these times existed. And the math doesn't work. And it's bananas. This is a bananas theory. And it was basically, if we look at how the Earth goes around the sun, we'll be missing some days, which will end up over time to be 300 years. And these 300 years were the Dark Ages. And it all came about because some people wanted to live in the year 1000. But, and it does say in this episode on YouTube, like, they would have to get the rest of the entire world to get on board with that for it to be true.
Creating other people creating like various events and stuff like that. So it's crazy. So, and it just turns out like his theory was based on how he looked at the creation of the Gregorian calendar And he just got something wrong. Like he literally thought the Gregorian calendar was starting at one point, but really starts at a different point. And that's how he kind of mixes it up.
Basically, it's one of those things where someone came up with a crazy theory and other people have had to take the time out to prove why it's not true. When really, it just doesn't make any sense in the first place. So we should put a link to the video, Peter, but everyone should just rest assured that the early Middle Ages did exist. Those 300 years did exist. Charlemagne did exist. The Tang Dynasty did exist. All of this stuff existed. So we really shouldn't worry about this disappearing phantom time.
Yeah, it does bring up some interesting points in the sense that there are a lot of times we don't know exact dates for people who reigned. I'm thinking of the very first Norwegian king is said to reign for 70 years, 60 or 70 years, which is unlikely, right?
It's unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely.
We don't have dates. We know people existed at one time, but we have no time when they lived or died. There are battles that happened. We don't know when that battle took place, even within the same year, because chroniclers, one chronicler will say it happened in 734, another will say 739. And historians, we all have to kind of make judgments on when things happened, what kind of order. And medieval historians were the same thing. That was one of the biggest things, just trying to figure out how many years passed between this and that. The idea that the calendar that we use, the Anno Domini calendar we use in the West, it's not something it's even around at the start of the early Middle Ages. It's something that gets kind of invented and gradually comes into use. This is something, because people we're going to use the old Roman calendar. People the Byzantines kind of use another calendar. The Jewish community uses a calendar. Islamic, they develop their own calendar as well. So it's fairly difficult to kind of figure out particular dates.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons people call this the Dark Ages is because there isn't centralized administration there was during the Roman Empire. And then when the nation states kind of built themselves up and were more centralized and stuff. So you just kind of consider in the meantime, if you ask 5 of your friends when something happened that happened I don't know, more than 10 years ago, they're going to be guessing and it's not going to be accurate. So we can't judge these people too harshly. You got to look at the sources and be how important was it that they got this exact date right? They may not have been all that invested in getting the exact date right, or they may have been using a different calendar. So this isn't because they were dumb. There's different reasons for why they might not have the same date for things. So enough about calendars. Okay. Let's talk about when the Middle Ages ended, because no one can agree on this either. So we talk about the beginning, no one can agree on that. We talk about the end, no one can agree on that either. So people talk about the time afterwards as being either the Renaissance, which literally means the rebirth, or the early modern period. So, and I think these terms really kind of determine what we're talking about in a lot of ways. Okay, so the end of the Middle Ages. Tell me about this, Peter.
All right. The first date that people have kind of thrown out is another exact date. It's April 8th, 1341. And this is a date when Petrarch gets chosen to be the poet laureate in Rome. So I guess they have a little ceremony on that day. And somebody says, you will be the poet laureate of the city of Rome. Congratulations. Yay.
Yeah, and there's a big party. Well, it's Easter anyway on that day.
Petrarch is kind of seen as one of the beginners of the Renaissance era. All right, this is when the Renaissance becomes, right? And therefore the Middle Ages ends.
So to me, this is really leaning on the term Renaissance as in rebirth, as in coming back to classical texts and classical styles and things like that. And when people talk about Renaissance, as in the Italian Renaissance, that is earlier than the Renaissance that people are talking about when they're talking about England, for example. So the Italian Renaissance is earlier. So if you're looking at that as being the end of the Middle Ages, well, it makes sense that you look at Petrarch, right?
In a sense, yeah, that you have a birth of a new intellectual and artistic movement. I always found that the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, they coincide, they overlap. I think people would say, no, they can't. There's the Middle Ages and then there's the Renaissance, and they can kind of coexist. But it's, in very many other ways, Italy itself and the rest of the world does not change on, April 9th. So
yeah, a memo goes out.
To me, it's a hard thing to grasp that this is some sort of a big shift. But I think, for a lot of people it is.
Yeah. Again, as you say, like in Italy, especially, this is a big shift culturally. But if we're looking at 1341 in Northern Europe, or the northern parts of Europe, it's the middle of the Hundred Years' War. It's pre-plague. And so if we think, for example, like the Black Death is the Middle Ages, then this this date doesn't work out, but it does work out kind of in literary terms. So this is kind of a cultural date, I would say.
Yeah, we can certainly see that there's changes in Italy, but putting it to a particular date doesn't seem to make sense. And I think there's lots of other people who have put like different dates for the Renaissance beginning as well. So that's just one date, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So.
That's not the one that you go with. Okay, so that's cultural. If we go to back to the Romans, the ancient Roman Empire, another date that you could pull out as the end of the Middle Ages is 1453. What happens in 1453?
Constantinople falls. So it is the end of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottoman Empire has been kind of pressing on the Byzantines for, about 50 years or so. But they finally have a siege where they kind of conquer the city, and it still remains Constantinople. It just becomes under Ottoman rule. But in some ways, it's the real end of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. And whenever I think about this, I think of that song by They Might Be Giants, right? Istanbul.
Yeah, exactly. I think of that too.
It was Constantinople, and now it's Istanbul. Yeah, so this is the end of the Roman Empire as we have known it. So we lost the Western Roman Empire, if we're going to go with this concept, back in the 5th century, and this is the end in the 15th century of the Byzantine Empire, so the last vestiges of the Roman Empire.
And again, we're kind of seeing that Constantinople by this time is literally just a city-state. The Byzantine Empire is literally one little state. It's not particularly important. In Europe, there are kind of howls of protest, but no one does anything about it.
It happens a lot in history. People howl, but they don't do anything about it. Okay, so for people who are North American or South American or Central American, there might be another date that we would go with, which is, of course, 1492, right? So 1492.
And the ocean blue, but it's, Columbus kind of runs into the Americas as he's trying to sail to China and India, but by mistake, he doesn't quite know how large the Earth is. He gets that wrong. So he believes he actually hits India, and that's why the Caribbean sometimes gets known as the West Indies. But yeah, like it is a huge geopolitical and cultural change because you now have Europeans now reaching out into much of the rest of the world. Europeans did know about the Americas to some extent. We had like Norse settlers into Greenland and as far as into present-day Newfoundland. We know of fishermen from Bristol that would travel to like the Atlantic Ocean off Canada to go fishing. So people had some idea, but it wasn't a particularly well-known thought. But there was some idea that were lands to the west. But this is now the first time we actually have large-scale exploration by Spanish and Portuguese sailors, and they're just quote-unquote discovering all these lands, and it brings in large settlements as well. So you have Spain and Portugal becoming wealthy empires because of this.
Yeah. So it wasn't a suicide mission. People didn't think that they would fall off the edge of the earth. I mean, we've talked about that a lot of times. They didn't think the earth was flat. They knew they were going to find something. It wasn't the first time that people had made contact with the continents that were west of Europe, but it was the first time they were able to really establish colonies and really keep a hold on it because the Vikings left. And this is the first time that people from Europe stayed and obviously made a huge impact on the globe by doing so. So 1492, important date for when things really started to change. I think that's an important date to really stick with. And then the other one that's really a classic date for when the Middle Ages ended is 1517. What is big about 1517?
Yeah, there's a German priest named Martin Luther, and he has some beefs with the Roman Catholic Church. And on like October 31st, he nails some theses, like a list of grievances on the church door. And after a little while, people start noticing him. And it's the start of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And again, if we look at Constantine and the adoption of Christianity as it being a turning point into the Middle Ages, It's another massive change within Christianity that kind of ends the Middle Ages with, in Europe, the Catholic hegemony being split into, a series of very much competing differences in the faith.
It is an important date, but like we've said with the political stuff, it's not as if this was a date when everything changed and before this no one had thought of these ideas and after this people had thought of these ideas, because we know that in different countries, I mean, if we're talking about English speaking worlds, again, we're talking about John Wycliffe and the Lollards in the 14th century coming up with a lot of the same ideas. Like, we can't call them Protestants because they're not exactly the same, but they're coming up with ideas that are anti-Catholic. And so it's been shifting all over the place, especially in places like the Netherlands for a while. But when Martin Luther nails these 95 theses to the door, people say this is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. But over that next 30 years or so, things really begin to change in terms of religion. So I think that this is kind of one of the reasons why I pick around 1500 as being the end. But it's not just because of the Protestant Reformation, but that is an important thing that happens right after 1500. I pick 1500, again, sort of because of Protestantism establishing itself right after that. But there's a whole bunch of things that really change around the same time within about 50 years that to me kind of signal a big change. So I don't like to use Renaissance because I don't really like what that term means literally, but there are a lot of changes that happen. So over the course of the 15th century and into the 16th century, we have a lot of changes, including making contact with the Americas. We have gunpowder. That's happening over the 14th and 15th centuries. We have an increase in literacy because of the printing press. I mean, that's huge. And so there's a whole bunch of things that I think change culturally and politically around this time, which is why I pick around 1500 as being the end.
Yeah, I think we would kind of look at political and religious, but technological changes, in particular the printing press and gunpowder, do have massive effects on government, society, education, everything like that. And again, it's hard to say, hey, there's a particular date, right? Because these are technologies that filter around the medieval world, right? Both starting in China. And sometimes, say when people defines the Middle Ages in China, it ends with the end of Yuan dynasty in 1368. Some scholars said, well, that's the end of the medieval period of China, is around 1368. And this is part when both technologies are in full swing in China. And so, yeah, I have a lot to think of that those have a major effect. Historians of the future will be looking around the 1970s to 1990s and the computer and how much of a vast change that had. And that's just a technological change, right? It's not the end of the Cold War was such a big deal. It's going to be digital. So
yeah. And then, when will you pick the date? Was it the date when the first PC was made? Was it the date when the internet was first established? That kind of thing. And it's the same type of thing. As we were saying, you have gunpowder being used in Europe in the 14th century, but by the 15th century, everybody is using it within Europe. It's changed warfare. The printing press has made it so that more people can read more things more cheaply. So that a century later, people are copying down Shakespeare's words in the playhouses and they're selling them on the street for people to pick up for cheap. This is a huge revolution that happens over about 100 years. I do pick the English speaking examples because that's my specialty, but this is happening all over Europe. So I think, I'll pick around 1500 as being the end. But for me, it's not just about religious or political change, but about cultural and technological change, as you say.
Have we thought anything about ideas of health and pandemics as being changes? We kind of mentioned a little bit before the Black Death, but there's the Justinianic plague in the 6th century. That's another kind of people kind of take a look at that. Can that be considered a changing time, right? Brings in the Middle Ages but it's hard to say. The Black Death has important social and economic factors in it, but does it end the Middle Ages? I don't think so.
No, I wouldn't think so. It does have huge cultural effects. And I'm not a religious scholar, but I would argue that it had a big effect on maybe the pebbles that were starting to roll down that would come to be the avalanche of Protestantism, especially because people had a lot of questions around what was going on with religion when, if we're doing all this praying, like, why aren't we being saved? Are we being punished? That kind of stuff. So I think that these pandemics were milestones, like hugely important times, but I don't think they were the end of an era type thing.
Yeah, and I think also they don't have any really huge impacts politically. Like, we don't see empires or states falling in the wake of the Black Death. Not like, England and France, were fighting before and they're fighting after. You don't see massive changes of borders and things like that. Like, not as you would see in the late 15th and 16th centuries, right?
Yeah. I mean, you do have revolts and revolutions and some change in how people are paid and maybe their status, and maybe they can move up in the world a bit better. But it's not the same as the French Revolution, for example. We're not looking at the same thing. So yeah, I'm not sure that pandemics would be the beginning or end of any eras. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? When were the Middle Ages?
I guess, we often kind of think there's a frame of mind, like, when do knights exist? When do castles exist? Those things gradually fade away, and like the Middle Ages gradually fades away. Some people come in like, well, is the 18th century the Middle Ages? Well,
no.
No,
No, it's not.
they,
I know people have made that argument, but I'm coming down on this as not being the Middle Ages.
The Middle Ages kind of gradually fade into what we might call the early modern era. We like to put in very specific kind of dates and times, but what we're seeing is kind of gradual shifts in the world. And that's what we see today, where we see just change doesn't happen within days. It takes years, decades, centuries, right? Like, as a historian, I always kind of like the rolling of time. So it can pass quite slow.
Yes, and if you're listening to this podcast, you can also pick your own times as to when the Middle Ages started and ended, and hopefully these give you some ideas as to when you can pick. Okay, Peter, tell us what is on the website this week.
Well, we have a piece you did originally for Medieval Magazine about pilgrim badges. So yeah. I don't know if you remember doing that, but we posted that onto the website.
I do. I don't remember all my articles, to be honest, because I think there's a couple hundred now, but I do remember that one, yes.
So, yeah, so it was a nice, good piece. We have that. We have a piece on a 10th century embassy to Constantinople by a Frankish diplomat. Apparently did not have a very good time with the Byzantines. Didn't share the same likes in food. We have that, and we also have some news about the discovery of a cave.
The discovery of a cave, or the stuff that's in the cave?
Well, they discovered the cave. There's some stuff in it, so, but yeah, it's interesting. Like, people kind of stumble across a cave, right? So, and like during these days, I think any news that's not coronavirus is good news, right?
It's all interesting now. It's all interesting. Well, thanks, Peter, for coming on and helping us establish. Well, we didn't really establish anything, but to talk about when the Middle Ages were. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you to all the patrons who support this podcast on patreon.com, making it possible for me to keep bringing you medieval content when you might just need it most. Every bit of your patronage is so appreciated. If you're thinking about becoming a patron yourself, now is a great time to do it, because if you choose to get yourself a digital or paper subscription to Medieval Warfare through our Patreon page, you'll not only be helping out the podcast, but your first issue will feature a cover story by yours truly on the fall of Camelot. Find out more at patreon.com/medievalists. For the whole Middle Ages from the 4th century to the 16th, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books, including Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, on Amazon or through your local bookstore. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening. Have yourself an amazing day.